IVM.
There is another dancing elephant which I have, which I had got in Kabini, and it was like, my early days of photography. That is the time I learned that you cannot actually step down in a jungle. I saw this lone tusker, elephant which was digging up shoots of grass on the Kabini banks. I was so excited. I told my guide, "Can you stop? I just want to, go down and take an image." He was like, "Are you mad?" I was like, "Why? What happened?" He's like, "You can't step down in a national park." I was like, "Oh, I didn't know." I said, "I want a ground level image." He said, "Boss, I will lose my job."
Hello and welcome to the Filter Coffee Podcast. One of the most interesting people I've met recently is Rakesh Dareshwar, an amateur wildlife photographer who's also a marketer in his day job. I've always been fascinated by wildlife photographers in general. When you and I look at a bird and go, how cute or how beautiful, Rakesh is the kind of person who will tell you its ornithological family, its zoological name, where it migrated from, and why the sheen around its neck is really, really rare. I want to speak to Rakesh about what it takes to be a wildlife photographer. What happens in the hours and days that precedes an extraordinary photograph, and why the wilderness is spiritual for him. Welcome to the Filter Coffee Podcast, Rakesh.
Thanks, Karthik, for inviting me here. And, it's not a regular feature where, wildlife photographers do interviews and all. So it's a very nice feeling to, be acknowledged in a way.
As you know, we've been trying to do this for months. While prepping for it, I actually discovered a lot of wildlife photographers who I didn't know up until now. I want to talk to you about some of the famous photographers later in the episode. But, I want to start off with a day in the life of a wildlife photographer, right? On a day in which you're shooting. Can you describe what goes on in the day?
It's a very interesting question you ask, right? Because, a professional wildlife photographer versus an amateur one, somebody who does it day in, day out versus somebody, who does it intermittently, for example, right? Somebody like me, who has to manage a day job and, follow the passion. What happens with, most of the amateur wildlife photographers is that they have to plan their trip in advance. So a lot of time goes into ensuring that it is the right kind of trip you're going to make, because in the end, they also look at an ROI in the sense that they return back with, as many good images and a variety of species as possible. They also look at, the travel plans. We also have to kind of look at, which are the best guides available in that area, so that we connect with them and then, ensure that we get them to be our guides. The other thing is you also prepare a lot about what kind of equipment you carry. So for example, I have a whole host of cameras and lenses I have, but I do not carry it necessarily for every trip I do. Nowadays, what also happens is that if you are maybe renting out your equipment, a lot of people do that as well, because given the high expense of owning a camera and the lenses,
and also
I think
technology
it makes
keeps
more
evolving every few years.
Exactly. I think you pointed out that perfectly. So the point is that a lot of people then have to plan whether the equipment they require or they want is available at that point in time. So all of these are stuff which you need to juggle with. You need to also look into, say, for example, I predominantly do more of bird photography than anything else. So I need to also see what kind of species I'll be getting, right? You'll also be looking at, what kind of images I want to make there. So you basically visualize that. The other thing is...
Sorry to interrupt you, but the starting point for all of this is, do you pre-decide the region, the specific region that you go to? Because you spoke about talking to locals and then taking the appropriate equipment, etc. Is that the first step to sort of decide on where you're going to go?
So a lot of people have different ways of doing it. So for example, I mean, like trying to explore places around the city you live. So for example, from NCR, there are so many places where you can go. If you're doing birding, then there is Bharatpur, for example, which is, one of the most famous bird spots as far as water birds are concerned across the globe. Then there is the hills, right from the Spiti Valley, which will give you the snow leopards and the lammergeier, coming down all the way to Uttarakhand and Himachal with their beautiful, beautiful hill birds. The variety is astounding. The color palette is just brilliant. You go all the way to Northeast, right? So some people do it geographically. Some people have triggers. For example, I did the Satal trip somewhere in 2010. At that point in time, internet had just evolved. People were just looking at, different kind of birds. 5-day working had just started. There was the IT boom. People had time on hand, money also. Right. So there were a lot of people who were looking forward to making such trips. I was one of the first persons to actually go to Satal and then, put it back on a platform which we had at that point in time. And then Satal became one of the main, birding destinations for a lot of people. So it's the trigger also. What do you see? Like, for example, 2 years back, it landed, in my lap just like that because a cousin of mine had actually planned a trip to the Northeast. I always wanted to do it, but never could. And the guy who had actually planned that whole trip fell sick and they had one spot left. And for me, it was like, something which I always wanted to do. And I joined that trip. And to date, it is one of my best trips I've done because the variety of birds I saw, the kind of images I got were amazing. It is astounding. The depth, what Northeast can offer is something very, very different.
So you're talking about the Satal trip. I'm sorry, I'm just want to go back there. Talking about what goes on a typical day. Before it became, like you said, a destination for bird photographers, what triggered that as a destination for you?
Again, there was another person who had done that trip. And intermittently, he used to post some images, which was extremely rare. And, those birds which you had never seen. So my brother, he stopped photography nowadays, but he used to be an avid photographer himself, and a friend of mine. And, we got together saying that let's, try to do something which is not there on the birding map. And then we saw these images and then we said, let's do this because it's not something which people have actually gone to, and then it's a lot of planning more than anything else. You connect with the tour operators and, you ensure that your travel is perfect. You ensure, like I said, the guide is perfect. And guide is something which, can make or break a trip because they have immense knowledge about the local species, their behavior and where to find them. It is uncanny that, there are some guides who can actually tell you that, okay, there is almost like a 90% chance of getting this bird. So different, people have different ways of doing it. For us, it was a free run. Nowadays, there are people who will actually say, I want to get this species. And they will run after that. I know such people as well. The moment there is something which, something comes up on the internet that this species is being seen in, so-and-so place, people just take the next flight out, reach that place, ensure that they shoot it, and then they put it back on social media. So it's just become a kind of a race as well.
And that's what they seek, right? That also brings me to the question. You have a day job which is in marketing. And, that's been your career as well, right? What was your trigger to pick up wildlife photography at such a deep level?
See, I mean, I've tried to figure that out quite a bit in my mind, and I could never get a answer, right? Like one single answer. But what has been, if I can try and decode it, we used to, when I was young, my dad used to take me back to our native place, which is, a place in coastal Karnataka. The beach was around 500 meters away. There was a river which was like, just around 700 meters away. And we had a house in the middle. And the beauty of those vacations were that it used to be a month-long vacation. And it used to be something where we used to do nothing. So I used to spend my time, going around, stay the whole day at the beach, come back in the evening, go to the riverbank, observe nature as such. So I think that is what would have, developed a latent love for nature. Plus, at one point in time, Dad gifted me the World Book Encyclopedia, and I used to wonder at those kind of images and the variety of birds which were there. That basically attracted me to nature as such. Photography came much later. In fact, it was more of a spontaneous decision where a friend of mine had come back from US and he had a SLR. And I was like, dude, can you when you go back, can you buy one for yourself? Because I cannot get an SLR here. And he was like, okay, you can take this one. And I bought it of him and, my journey started. It was as simple as that. And my first trip was to a place called Dandeli in Karnataka. Where I saw a green bee eater, which is a fairly common bird. I took a photograph and I started weaving a lot of stories in my mind that this bird might have flown some, thousands of kilometers and come here. And I am the guy who's got this image and stuff like that. And the next time when I bought a bird book, I realized that, there's so many birds around, just if you observe. And then, it just started. The journey started. I don't even know where, I started changing those orbits, so to say. It just went from one orbit to another.
Right. We were talking about day in the life of a wildlife photographer or an amateur wildlife photographer. But I'm assuming on the days you're making the trip, it doesn't matter that you're an amateur or a professional. I'm assuming the day sort of pans out the same way. Whether it is Dandeli, you spoke about the Satal trip that you did, or so many others that you've done. After you set out, after you've spoken to the locals, then what happens? What is the experience like? Talk to us about the next few hours, days that go into getting what you want.
I just got transported into one of those locations. I just went back to Arunachal Pradesh. Right? I mean, you wake up around 4 o'clock in the morning. And, this will be an anecdote which hopefully will, answer your question. So you wake up at 4 in the morning, you stay in a place. So we stayed there in a place which had electricity only for 3 hours. In the evening. So what you basically do is you charge all your batteries, you charge all your cameras, you ensure that you charge your mobile so that you can make calls back, to civilization, tell them that you're alive and stuff. Because throughout the whole area, there are only 3 points where you get, mobile coverage. So all of that you do, you carry your laptop, because you need to keep backing up images. That's something which digital photography has ensured that we do. So you basically carry a lot of luggage. You ensure that everything is right. You wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You have a pre-decided route which you are going to take. There are times when you have to trek it. There are times when you do it from a vehicle. So here it was a combination, and we would start wherever the guide would feel that, or wherever we would spot birds, we would stop and then we would make images. And then there would be certain spots which, the guide would know that, the birds would congregate there, and then we wait for them. So it is quite a tough thing to do, because most of the cameras, the SLRs at least, if you really want high quality images and stuff, are heavy in nature. Plus, if you need stability, and especially in places where, the light is not great and you have birds which are skulkers, which, get back into the bushes, and you need to make images of them, then you need a very high end camera which can actually, shoot them at high ISOs, and also the fact that you need a tripod to shoot them, right? So all of that, for me, my equipment weighs around 11 and a half, 12 kgs, which I have to carry around. You typically do around, you start in the morning at 4, you reach a place, the light comes on, then you start, shooting the birds, you wrap it up by say around 9:30, you come back, you have your breakfast, and, especially in the hills and all, you can again go back for birding the whole day, right? So what you basically do is from 9:30, you go back again, you shoot up till 1 o'clock, come back, have your food, try and back up all your images you've shot throughout the day, through the half day. You're back at 3 o'clock again shooting till the light, goes off at around 6:37. Most of the places for bird photography and also for, some mammal photography, what you do is, you try to find out nocturnal species. So there are times when, you wind up at around 10:30, 11 o'clock trying to find out, nightjars and owls and, other species, maybe even leopards and stuff. So it's a very exciting, day, but it is backbreaking. Once you come back, what happens is you charge all your equipment, because, normally the camera, because you've been shooting the whole day, it would last only for a day or maybe 1.5 day at the most. But just to ensure that there's no risk, you keep charging all of that, and you make a commitment to yourself that the next day morning you're not going birding.
Why?
But because it's so tiring. I mean, and this happened to me. So I had, Mishmi Hills. I mean, it is basically a hill, right? And you walk so much. You walk around 10 kilometers carrying that, 10 and a half, 11 kgs of equipment. You stop wherever you get the bird, you focus, you shoot. It was cold, so you have 3-4 layers, of clothes, of jackets and stuff, and you are tired to the bone. You come back and you say, because I have 7-8 days of shooting, what I'll do is tomorrow morning I'll, rest easy.
Oh, okay. You mean like space it out is what you mean.
Space it out. But trust me, but trust me, next day, instead of 4, you wake up at 3:30. I said, dude, I don't want to miss it. And that happened with me, it happens.
Right. I was just reading, preparing for this episode about how do wildlife photographers pack. And there was one article which was saying that it's very important that you also have a multi-tool and a waterproof notebook with you, etc. Right? You spoke about waking up at 4 and reaching the place. Assuming whether it is the night or early in the morning, there is also a lot of waiting involved. And what kind of a place are you standing or sitting or hiding? Hey, can you describe that for us?
So that's a very interesting question, and the thing is that when we say waiting, it's more of anticipation, right? So in anticipation, you ensure that, okay, you've reached a place. There are some likely species you're going to get around, right? You try hearing for sounds. You try identifying birds with sounds. So there's one example I can give you of the Mishmi wren babbler, right? So this is one bird which is found in a place in Mishmi Hills, and it was discovered after some 70 years after declaring it extinct. It was rediscovered, and it is found only in, a certain altitude in Mishmi Hills. So there is a 3.5 kilometer stretch where you'll either get it or you won't. So we were targeting the Mishmi wren babbler, and when we went there, we went to the place and we could hear it. Now, our guide he said that it is around 500 meters away up the hill. So there is a very, very low chance that it will come down. So we were like, sitting it out, trying to get some other birds, but standing there so that, when it comes, we will definitely get it. The, wait lasted around 1 hour, 40 minutes odd. And, it was almost lunchtime. And then the guide said, let's go for lunch and come back. Maybe after that we'll, try it again. Now, knowing that, this species is something which is so rare and you have to make some, if you get a hazy picture of, or even if you get to sight it, it's an experience, right? I mean, like, because you never know when you're going to come back to this place. So what we told him is, don't worry, we can extend this. We will not have lunch today. We will, maybe see what to do. So he was like, why are you guys so paranoid about it? There is a good chance that, it will come after we have lunch. So somehow we were very adamant, and luckily all three of us, told him that let's wait for another 20 minutes. It's, chalo, at least 2 hours is a good time for us to wait. And in the next 10 minutes, it came down and it gave us some mind-boggling images. It actually came onto the road. It came on in the open, and that guy was like, this bird never comes out in the open. I don't know what you guys did, but you guys are very, very lucky. So those 2 hours.
Can you describe the bird right? for those of us who are not into ornithology?
So it's a very, it's a small bird about the size, of something between a sparrow and a myna. Both are common, most people know. So, and it has got this metallic golden sheen on it, almost, trending towards brownish color, and it's metallic, it shines. And it's got a rufous patch, almost orange patch under its neck. And with every different angle you see it, the color is, the iridescence is so different. You see it differently, and it shines, and it is something which is undescribable. What I can also do is, try and give you a link which you can put it on the.
I will put it on the show notes. Yeah,
if people can, go and see it, it is worth seeing it. It's a small bird, but extremely rare. It was actually given up, saying that it is extinct almost for 70 years, and it was rediscovered there. So it's something, which just shows that you cannot give up on things, right? They might just come back. So it is something which is very at a level which is, very philosophical also. The birds have done that, for me. They've ensured that, there's some kind of patience which I have developed, because waiting for them and doing nothing is also such a joy. In fact, such an honor to, spend time in nature, even if you don't get anything. Your objective should be more to spend time, in places like this, rather than, trying to go running for species or birds or, anything else.
I love the choice of words, you used to describe the bird, as well as, the word honor you just used. Probably just a year and a half back, what this reminds me of is, me and a friend, we had gone for a tour of the Amazon.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, this is the part in Colombia. We had gone to Leticia, which is this really small village, which is at the confluence of Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. And from there, it's an easier trek into the forest, right? And we had gone for this night trek into the Amazon, and we had gone with some of the tribals there, right? And that's the densest I've ever been to inside a forest. I think.
That's super dense.
It's super dense, and it was weird because imagine it's around 3:45 in the afternoon, and you look at your feet. You need a torch. It's absolute darkness, right?
Yeah,
but if you look up, it's a canopy, and you can see that it is actually broad daylight, right? And we spent the night and much of the next morning, and I'm reminded of that when you say you're waiting for this to come. And
Yes.
what does it entail? Like, for example, it's also not necessarily safe, right? I mean, the places that you go to get the best shots, you have to probably also deal with reptiles and other threats as well. Does it happen to you?
There was a time when I was attacked by people trying to rob me in broad daylight in a forest of Bangalore, the Bannerghatta forest. But, those are rare, right? It does happen. I mean, like, if you go alone and stuff, it's always better to, have people with you. Because these are, back of beyond places. Other than people, the threats could be if you are, in the outskirts of a jungle, elephants can be dangerous. They are not the ones to be petted. So, I mean, like, you might have all the, lovely comic books and, jungle books talking about, how beautiful they are and how they can talk to humans. It's better to, be away from them because those guys have brute power. So elephants is something which can be, something which you have to watch out. The other common ones are, normally insects and snakes. So if you can, ensure that you wear, the knee boots, which are like, come up to the knee and all. So you're fairly safe, especially in those kind of jungles and grasslands as well. But otherwise, I think more or less, it's much safer than being in a city, I would say. The chances of you being hit by a car or being mugged and stuff like that is much, much higher in a city. There, I think, I've met one of, the most warmest of people in tribals and in villages. They will feed you, they will talk to you, they will enjoy with you, they will smile with you. The whole experience, right? It is not only about the photography per se. I think the whole experience actually lends itself, something which is much, much more than, just being about trying to get one bird shot or something. So the moment I see one image, it does not only conjure up, the what I shot, but the whole trip,
right?
The whole experience per se.
That is
that's something which is
amazing. Talking of which, Rakesh, you spoke about the Mishmi and that entire experience. Is that your most memorable experience, or is there some other?
So yeah, while Mishmi Hills definitely is, something which I will always treasure. In terms of, if I have to rank between different trips, I really wouldn't be able to do that. But, there are some trips which are extremely memorable. Like the Sattal trip I spoke about. There are some jokes which, we still share, between my brother and my friend, on the stuff which we did. And that was something which was, more than 10 years back. The other one which is extremely memorable is the Kenya trip I took with my dad and my elder brother. It was 11 days of total fun. I bonded with my dad like never before. It was a road trip completely through and through, 11 days. While the photography was something which was exceptional, something very, very awesome. And, it was an eye-opener to see that, the vast expanse of grasslands which Masai Mara is. You see so many, such a variety of animals, at arm's length. And it is something which is humbling, basically. I went during the migration. And I could see almost, lakhs and lakhs of gnus and zebras. And that was something, it almost felt like that I was in the Mecca of wildlife.
Wow.
So, when you get off your local environment, right? And you actually move continents, there is a big change in terms of the kind of birds or animals you start seeing. For example, stuff which is very, very rare in India is anyway very difficult to see. but even the common, birds in Africa are alien to you. And you've got just that duration of, your trip to the next continent to see these birds. However common they are in that part of the world, for you, everything is new. And that is another experience, moving out of a whole continent, seeing birds and animals which are endemic to those places. And in all of that, like even a small sunbird right up to, the ostrich, which I saw, these were all moments which were new for me. So in a way, Africa again opened up that space, which, if you remember, I spoke about the encyclopedia, which my dad gifted. And, the variety of birds and animals which were there in that encyclopedia, all of that started playing back when I, made that trip to Africa. So it kind of actually gave me back my childhood, so to say, those memories which I always envisioned that I will go once to Masai Mara and see these animals, with my very own eyes. So I think that was a superlative experience. But also there is one thing which I would like to say is that I also saw a black-shouldered kite, which is quite common in India. It almost felt like, I met a lost cousin there. It felt so nice to see somebody, okay, back from home. It almost as if, you could start speaking to him in Hindi. That, you got that guy there. So that was, those were some amazing experiences. Also, exclusively getting my elder brother and my dad, bonding with them, in an environment which I'm extremely comfortable, which I love, nature as such. And somewhere those long trips, those long drives were completely fun filled. There was no formalities, there was no hierarchy, so to say. It was almost as if, we were three friends on a, all male trip, all guy trip, doing full time pass. It was something which I will always cherish.
It's beautiful, and it is also sort of a poetic loop, right? Given that your interest in nature and wildlife started with your dad going to his native place and with the books he gifted to you.
And it was kind of a catalyst, right? He was not overtly somebody who would, talk to me about nature or, stuff like that. But he almost became a catalyst for me, ensuring that, those are the right cues I got. I picked it up from him, basically because he ensured that, we go back to our roots, we go back to nature, and those books, like, those were a gold mine. That was my internet, actually, that point in time.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And it's true, right? Like, our parents didn't speak about nature like it was a separate subject. And it was part of...
Exactly. Because it was a part of them, if you really look at it.
Yeah. And, I appreciate, what you also said about, I think it's important who you make these trips with. The more you speak about it, and earlier when you were talking about Mishmi, you were also talking about the sounds that you hear. And that really took me to, I'm just going back to the same trip I spoke to you about earlier, of Laetitia. In fact, I made that trip with my closest friend, my childhood friend. And I'm reminded of this moment when we were doing a night trek into the Amazon, and it was probably about midnight or so when we were trying to cross a stream, and we were going with a local person who was actually translating what the tribal caretaker was telling us. Right, we had gone with a tribal person because we don't speak the language. There was a translator who also came with us. So four of us, we were there the entire night. And there was a point when, the tribal chief sort of asked us to switch off our flashlights. And this is actual night in the Amazon.
In the Amazon.
Yeah. And he was saying something about, not getting the attention of the crocodiles in the stream. But the moment we switched off the light, it also was for the first time, even though I've spent like 7-8 hours in the forest up until now, it's the first time that I started listening to the forest. And what seemed like a, desolate, lonely, dark place suddenly it switched on in my mind that you're probably in the Manhattan of wildlife, right? Because there are
Definitely.
so many sounds. You're hearing so many birds that you have not heard before, and yeah, that I remember also because of the people I was traveling with. So,
Sure.
the other thing I wanted to ask you, Rakesh, was you spoke about some of the best trips you've taken. There are some images that you will be, working weeks, months, sometimes years for, and sometimes you'll get there, sometimes you won't. In that sense, are there any trips of yours where the trip and the journey was probably successful, but you didn't really get what you went after?
It's very interesting you asked that because one of my most cherished trips was going to Spiti Valley to actually sight the snow leopard. And that's the gray ghost of the mountains, and it's actually a ghost. I mean, at least up till the last 5 years or 6 years before people have started sighting the snow leopard and photographing it, but still it's very, very rare, simply because the kind of habitat it stays in, and the approach to those habitats is not something everybody would like to undergo. So it's like a almost a 17 to 18 hour drive right from Chandigarh right up to either Hemis or you go to Ladakh. But then the fact is that it is above 14,000 feet above sea level, so it's just very tough conditions. And
which month
I had
did you
gone
go
to
in?
Spiti. That was February, and I can tell you this much that the day temperatures were minus 16 degrees, and the night temperatures went further down than minus 25 degrees.
I actually did not know.
Somebody who's
I did not know they allowed you to go in February, because I am like all tourists. When we went to Spiti, it was in August when the pass opened. But even that, it took us 2-3 days to acclimatize to the weather.
Yeah, so this is a road which goes through Ramnagar, and then it actually goes up. So it's the other way around. It does not go through Manali.
Okay.
So you basically the pass is still closed anyway. It doesn't open, I think, right up till May or something. It's only after May that the normal tourists actually go. People who are crazy enough to actually do such trips, they go in January and February. Because the snow leopard actually comes down to these lower reaches of the Himalayas. They actually stay further up in summer. Very, very rare to sight them in a Spiti Valley in summer. It must be a very desperate snow leopard to actually come down. So like I was saying, I mean, I couldn't get the snow leopard. I mean, that was my target species. But, and there are times when you go with an objective or, a species in mind when you make trips. But what it also, is a kind of a journey which, helps you meet people, helps you see more, different kind of environments, different landscape, different jungles. And, while you have one target species, it also comes with a bundle of so many other species. And I saw an abundance of, species which I had never ever seen. Like the lammergeier I saw, I mean, it's huge. It's got a wingspan of, more than 9.5 feet. I was awestruck to see them. They were huge. Then I saw the red fox, which is very, very cute. I had to stay, actually shot in minus 25 degrees because it came in the night, and I shot it in torch, with a torchlight. So,
wow.
So there were experiences which were different. The sky there, I mean, we hardly get to see the sky because of the city lights. You go to Spiti, every night you will never want to sleep. You'll just want to, actually envelop yourself with, the blanket called sky. It's so amazing to see, the abundance of stars. It almost like the sky is bathed in white. Right. It is a different surreal experience. So these are experiences which always, come with that. I've been to places like the Sundarbans, which is like, a completely different experience. Stayed there on the boat for 5 days, did not get off at all. So something which, you'll never experience in normal life.
Talking of normal life, sometime back you mentioned this one place you had gone to, which is I don't know, the home of king cobras. I forget which place.
Kudremukh and Agumbe Ghat. Yeah.
Okay.
The capital of king cobras.
Did you meet any in your?
No. So in my life, I've seen a king cobra in the wild only once, and that too was not on a trip. We were driving just off Udupi to go to a temple with the family, and 11 feet king cobra actually crossed the road.
Oh, wow.
So that was, I mean, that was another experience.
Brilliant.
And normally you'll get such experience when you don't have the camera. So that's a tip.
So the snow leopard is the one thing that you'll go back for.
100%. 100%.
Why is it I've seen many articles also talk about it as the holy grail of wildlife photography. What about it?
I think the conditions, right? A, the conditions, and B, you can see the whole vista, the whole landscape in front of you. No trees, nothing, right? It can be in front of you, just 100 feet away, staring at you, and you will not be able to make out whether it's there or no. It is that difficult to pick up a snow leopard in its terrain. Extremely, extremely difficult. And, making that journey itself is like a Mecca Medina trip kind of a thing that you have to do once and if you are a wildlife photographer, you have to do these trips. The Masai Mara, for wildlife, that's one which is always, at the top of the list. The snow leopard, for example, because it's rare, it's very tough, it challenges you as a photographer and also as a human being. It also challenges your, stamina. I mean, in fact, when I had gone there, we had a 24-hour, doctor traveling with us, 24 hours. And when I saw the red fox, actually I had started running along with my gear. And he ran behind me and asked me to stop. He said that, you might just be off oxygen and you might just drop down, blacked out. You might not die, but you can black out any point in time because of lack of oxygen. So don't do anything strenuous. I was excited seeing the red fox, right?
Yeah.
So those are things which are there. I mean, it's tough,
right?
But it is satisfying.
And I can imagine why this is one of your more memorable trips. In fact, the thing you said about the snow leopard also reminded me of this forest saying that you mentioned, one which is you might not see a tiger.
See the tiger, but the tiger would have seen you.
Beautiful.
And it's surprising. I mean, like, it's very interesting that you bring that up because I have a very bad tiger luck. So I've seen it, and I normally see it in jungles where people normally don't get to see it. So I've seen it in Pench. I saw 5 together. That was the first time I saw it after 5 years as a wildlife photographer. Then I saw it in Sundarbans. I saw a couple of them. I saw one in Corbett, right? So these 3-4 places where normally people do not see tigers, I've seen. But I've never seen a tiger in Andhari Tadoba, which is supposed to be like, if you do not see a tiger, just go there types. It's one of those forests. It's also maybe because, the kind of season I pick up to actually go to the jungles. I love to go during the rainy season, during the off season. The surprises you get at that point in time is something very different. It also, keeps you away from, a lot of crowd. You don't see a lot of crowd there. You see the jungle as it should be. Very few people actually come in at that point in time. So, the other thing I was talking about was a tiger in Sariska. Again, very rare. Those are the things which I've been blessed with, but my tiger luck is not so great.
I really hope that improves. Where are you off to next? What's your next hunt?
So I just hope that, this coronavirus situation actually settles down. Next on my list are few places. One definitely is Arunachal Pradesh again, because I think Mishmi Hills was just the start of a journey for me as far as Northeast birding is concerned. So I want to do, the whole of Northeast, right from Arunachal to Assam to Sikkim, and the other states as well, Tripura for sure, because those are very beautiful, places, and I really do not know how long it will remain.
Right. Yeah.
Because I have something which I always put out, as a thing which I've observed, that this is the right time for me to, I'm very lucky that I took up photography at this era, and maybe I was born in this era also. That's very lucky, because 50 years back, the technology was not there to actually capture these animals. And 50 years hence, I'm not too sure if the animals will be there, even if we have the technology. So that's, that's another sad way of looking at it, but somewhere it is also the reality.
Rakesh, we spoke about how the reason I asked you about the snow leopard piece was about why do we go out? What is the objective of it? And part of it is also linked to what you want out of this, right? Which brings me to the question, what is the commercial viability of wildlife photography today if someone wants to pick it up as a vocation?
So I think you've touched, is a question a lot of wildlife photographers themselves ask. So on its own, still wildlife photography is something which, if you are commissioned, with some major players like, National Geographic or Discovery or, some research companies or, Animal Planet and such, then it is commercially viable. Otherwise, per se, still wildlife photography is more in stock photography and all. Though in India, it is not, taken as a very, very viable option as far as still wildlife photography is concerned. If we talk about moving or video wildlife photography, I think that is something which a lot of people have explored, and there are some amazing, Indians who are doing or creating waves as far as some amazing, wildlife docuseries are concerned. I mean, is it reason enough for people to shy away from it, saying that, okay, there is no commercial viability? What I would say is that, there are some things which are layered onto this, some things which, you can build on it so that it is commercially viable. One is teaching wildlife photography. That's a big plus. Teaching photography itself, not just the wildlife photography, but photography itself. That's another one. You also spread the knowledge about photography and wildlife as such. The third thing is talking about commercial viability is taking tours, or taking people, spreading this experience what you've had in the jungle and giving it to other people. So you take people around to places which actually flicked your switch, some experiences which were very dear to your heart, and you kind of explore it commercially as well, and by ensuring that you give people a similar kind of experience, right? And there is also the research part of it, and I see a lot of these young people who've actually gone into research. So in Spiti, I met a guy who was researching on the blue sheep, the Barhal, and he had been in Spiti for around 8 months, and he said that I'm going to be there for another year or so and then complete my research and go back. Then I found, I met one girl in Dandeli who was researching on hornbills, because Dandeli has this is a unique place where you get 4 different types of hornbills, right? From the Malabar pied to the Great Pied, the Malabar Grey and the Indian Grey, right? So it's a very unique place for researchers to do their research. The other thing is Northeast, where I've met Shashank Dalvi, who's an emerging wildlife photographer and an amazing researcher as well, who's, done research in herpetology, on frogs and, on birds and stuff like that. So these are very unique spaces, which
Right.
you can actually try and commercially explore.
I can't close this episode without asking you your own favorite. While I know you're going to say there's no one single favorite image of yours, what are some of those which are very close to your heart? And we'll try and see if we can actually have a link of that in the show notes as well.
Sure. So I'll talk about maybe 2 or 3 of them, right? There is one image in particular of the Baya weaver. It's just basically a nest which has been made. I'm sure a lot of people would have actually seen it because, if anything, the minimum reach I would guesstimate is around 1 billion for that kind of an image, though people wouldn't know that it is my image. So it is basically 3 Baya weavers fighting to get into the nest. Actually, there are 4. Right, and I discovered it recently that there were 4 Baya weavers in that. But what has made it amazing is this kind of a behavior which you normally don't see, them fighting, over a nest which is not totally made. But the fact that it comes back to me in various WhatsApp groups during Mother's Day, saying that, there is this mother who is, trying to help the small baby Baya weaver from falling off the nest. It's an amazing thing, but maybe the story made it viral. And it's gone all across the globe. Even now when I, explore through Twitter and stuff like that, on the best images and stuff, this somehow crops up with, very, very different
How do you feel
stories.
about it, especially when you're not credited in the story?
So see, the point is, one of the purpose for me doing wildlife photography is to create awareness. Not so much about me, but about the environment we live in, right? So this is somewhere, the objective is met. So I really, it's not something people are exploiting it commercially or something like that. It is a story which is going viral. My image is just helping them create those stories and then maybe, initiate something which is much more, experiential for them. Which is a great thing to have. Credit apart. But at least I know in my heart that, okay, this is my image and this is conjuring up, something very, very different for different people. It's nice to know that. Right? And there is another one, which is Mother's Day, but that went through viral through National Geographic. There is this mother rhino and a cub, at Lake Nakuru. And in the backdrop, you'll see is, flamingos. What is very unique is the love between, the bond between the mother and the baby rhino. But what is very different is that, there is this red patch in the background, which is full flamingos. You can't see it. It's very blurred, but it makes up for a very, very different rhino image. It is not something which you see normally. And this again is, something which comes up every Mother's Day, and normally National Geographic is the one which puts it out on Instagram and Twitter and so on and so forth. So that is another one which I love. Then there is another dancing elephant which I have, which I had got in Kabini, and it was like, my early days of photography. That is the time I learned that you cannot, actually step down in a jungle. I saw this lone tusker, elephant, which was digging up shoots of grass on the Kabini banks. And I was so excited. I told my guide, okay, can you stop? I just want to, go down and take an image. He was like, are you mad? I was like, why? What happened? He's like, you can't step down in a national park. I was like, oh, I didn't know. I said, I want a ground level image. He said, boss, I will lose my job. You cannot do this.
Wow.
So what I had to do is ask him to, park it in such an angle that I could sleep on the floor of the Jeep. and take an image. When you see that image, you will realize, it is, actually it adorns my drawing room as well. A whole 6 feet by 5 feet kind of a black and white image. It almost feels as if the elephant is dancing.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so these are things, which while, on the whole, when you see it as a scene, presenting it as your point of view or your perspective makes it different. And if you get a chance to tell a story behind those images, it makes it even much more, better.
Oh, brilliant. I can't wait to have links to these images
I will
on the show notes so people can experience, this entire story. It is beautiful, Rakesh. And, before we close, one other thing I also wanted to check with you is, many of us follow many different wildlife photographers. And I recently, again, preparing for this episode, I wanted to see who are some of the greatest wildlife photographers out there, right? And unlike cinema or music, it's not a very evident list. There are so many of them. And, names like Frans Lanting comes up a lot.
Yeah, and he's on the top for me as far as landscape is concerned.
Oh, wow.
So he's definitely one of my top guys.
Who are some of your other favorites? Like, for me personally, I think the person I love following the most is Christina Mittermeier, especially with the aquatic life. And of course, there's this one photograph of Nick Nichols that I admire a lot, which is, I think it's Tiger and her cubs. The more we talk, the more I'm amazed at how many Mother's Day evidences we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
There are many cubs feeding, and the mother is emitting this growl, which is like very powerful but protective mother. Who are some of your other favorites?
So, I would bucket it with international versus Indian, and I think to the point of being controversial, I think making images in India is slightly more difficult than, maybe in Africa or someplace like that. While the moment is something which you cannot deny, the ease of, photographing is much more there in those kind of places, given the kind of, setup they have, the vehicles, the guides, the place itself, right? It's more of a grassland kind of a thing. Shooting in jungles and all becomes much, much more difficult. A lot of, people outside also shoot out of hides, shoot in places which is already set up and stuff. So that way there are these, different nuances which are there. So Frans Lanting, you've already named him. I think it's one of the, the best photographers there have been as far as landscape and, wildlife is concerned. Currently, if you see, there is a guy called Steve Winters. Phenomenal, and he had done a National Geographic photographer who had showcased the leopards of India with camera traps and stuff. I mean, you should see it to believe it. Some amazing images, and some images which rival Steve Winters in the whole storytelling department is somebody who's from India, Nayan Khanolkar. He also won the National Geographic Photographer of the Year. Amazing photographer. I think his work on the leopards of Mumbai is par excellence. So, he's amazing. There is another guy called Ganesh HS who I follow, very much. And he's a very, very dear friend as well. He, is probably one of the most creative photographers, wildlife photographers I've come across. Has got a different perspective. He is, he conjures up images in your mind. It's not there for you to see. He's that level. He's amazing. Right. He also, by the way, won National Geographic, Photographer of the Year, I think 2 or 3 years back. Then there are some, contemporary photographers who I follow and, I've been lucky to, I've been friends with them. So there's Jayan Sharma, who also, is the owner of Toehold. Beautiful photography, amazing stuff he does. There's Sudhir Shivraman. There's Ratika Ramaswamy. These are names which, are just brilliant. There's Janie Maria, lady from Kerala. Her dedication towards bird photography is brilliant. Then there is Asim Kotalia, who's again, a very, very new joinee, but he does some amazing work as far as bird photography is concerned. So it's a mix, right? There are so many great names which we can take, but what social media has done is, it's also opened us to see a lot of peers as very, very, good motivators and good photographers. So while there have been loads and loads of people who've motivated me, I think these are the ones who keep motivating me daily. So
wonderful. Great. I think there's a wealth of information, Rakesh, both from your experience as well as with some of the names you mentioned. We'll try and capture.
Yeah. There's another one person I think, I cannot do without naming him, is Andy Rouse. He is somebody who, makes images and those images will give you the whole vista, the whole place, the whole habitat of where that animal or that bird is. And it is a different level. I think I forgot him, but I think he's amazing as well.
Beautiful. Rakesh, it's been absolutely fascinating. You've transported us many times in this chat to a wild, deep jungle, just listening to and watching these visuals and sounds. Thank you so much for this, and thank you for being on the Filter Coffee podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Karthik, because it actually transported me back to so many places. And during this COVID time where you are, stuck in your home and, you can't go out, this was something which, helped me move around my trips and stuff like that. And it had just helped me re-energize, if you really understand what I mean. Thanks a lot for that, and thanks for having me, on your podcast. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Rakesh. Cheers. So that was our show. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And filter_coffee. That's coffee with a K on Instagram.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. Some really fun guests on the network this week. Cyrus welcomed Dia Mirza to come and have a conversation about all kinds of different things. Danny Morrison was on Edges and Sledges, the cricket podcast. If you haven't heard that, that's always a fun listen. And Rahul Subramanian was on Football Should Fall to grow their ever more exciting list of guests. And it's not just that. Mantra Mugdha, old friend of ours, was on Advertising is Dead. Manu Pillai was on the Filter Coffee podcast. It's been one great guest after the other. And with that, we hope to catch you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.